The final event for today's Texas Book Festival features Sam Harris, co-founder and CEO of Project Reason, a nonprofit foundation devoted to spreading scientific knowledge and secular values in society. He discusses his new book, The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Values, after this short break.
And I'm a long-time book festival supporter, and I'm really glad to see so many people here late on a Sunday afternoon. I'm introducing Sam Harris, and everybody says, who's Sam Harris? Well, of course, he's the atheist, right? Jon Stewart calls Sam Harris a professional atheist. The New York Times says he heads the youth wing of the New Atheists. His first book, The End of Faith, ignited a worldwide debate about the validity of religion, and it won the 2005 PEN Award for Nonfiction. He gained many fans and, of course, many detractors, and so he wrote his second book in response to the unhappy Christians, and it's called Letter to a Christian Nation. His new book, which just came out the first part of October, is called The Moral Landscape, and in that he tears down the wall between scientific facts and human values, arguing that most people are simply mistaken about the relationship between morality and the rest of human knowledge. He urges us to think about morality in terms of well-being, viewing that these experiences of being well and being not so well as the peaks and valleys of the moral landscape. His message is that the questions of good and evil cannot be answered by what God says or what Scripture says or what my culture says. Posing the questions in this way allows us to be judgmental, saying I'm more moral than he is because my God says so, or abandoning judgment, saying I can't say whether anyone is more moral than anyone else because there are no right answers. Instead, he poses that there are right answers, allowing us to be judgmental, but the right answers are quantifiable through science instead of religion. Thus, we have to look to science to give us the answers. As Jon Stewart says, the subtitle of The Moral Landscape should be, Get Off Your Rear, Scientists. So who is this man, Sam Harris, that qualifies him to tell us that science should be the judge of morality? Sam first attended Stanford University as an English major, but he dropped out. 11 years later, he went back to Stanford and completed his bachelor's in philosophy. And in 2009, he obtained a PhD in neuroscience at UCLA. So he is a scientist and a philosopher. He's written in many journals, newspapers, magazines, and his work has been discussed in even more. He's a co-founder with his wife and CEO of the Project Reason, a nonprofit foundation devoted to spreading scientific knowledge and secular values in society. And we are so pleased to have him here at the Texas Book Festival today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I apologize. I'm somewhat captive to these microphones. So normally I would stand up and walk around and sweat even more than I'm about to sweat in front of you. It is hot, in case you hadn't noticed, but it is an honor to be here. It's the first time I've spoken in Texas, and thank you all for coming out. As you know, as many of you know, I've spent the last few years publicly criticizing religion, and when you do that, you immediately discover all the reasons why people think that's a bad idea. And they're not so many reasons, and the first reason is almost never that there's so much evidence for the existence of God. I mean, not even fundamentalists tend to lead off with a story about the empty tomb or the textual reasons why the Bible is probably the creator, written by the creator of the universe. what you hear from people on every point of the spectrum of belief is that religion is the only way to think about morality and human values in universal terms. Now, I used to think that was an entirely empty claim, because obviously atheists can be moral, atheists can be as moral as any religious person, and there are many other reasons to think that morality is not best gotten from religion, and I'll talk about some of those. But I've come to discover that it's actually not an entirely empty claim, because there are many very smart people, many very well-educated people in the scientific community and in the academic community more generally, who seem quite confused about how there can be such a thing as moral truth. And I'll give you an example that has really been seared on my brain and motivated my writing this book to some degree. I was at a conference and I was talking about the link between morality and human well-being. And I said, the moment you notice that human well-being is dependent in some way on the laws of nature and on states of the human brain, then you notice that there are right and wrong ways to maximize it. And we'll understand this more as science progresses, but we already know enough now to know that certain cultures are not maximizing human well-being. And I cited as an example the life for women in Afghanistan under the Taliban. It seemed to me rather obvious that the violent misogyny and religious bamboozlement of the Taliban was not the perfect recipe for human flourishing. And afterwards, a fellow speaker at the conference came up to me and said, well, how could you ever say that the compulsory veiling of women, forcing women to live in burqas, is wrong from the point of view of science? I said, well, it's wrong because the moment you admit that questions of right and wrong have something to do with human well-being, then it becomes immediately obvious that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not a perfect way of maximizing it. And she said, well, that's just your opinion. I said, well, okay, let's make it simpler. Let's say we found a culture that was removing the eyeballs of every third child. Okay, would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said, well, it would depend on why they were doing it. Okay. I said, after I picked my jaw back up off the floor, I said, okay, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture that says every third should walk in darkness or some such nonsense. And she said, then you could never say that they were wrong. Okay, so this, I perceive a problem here because, first of all, this is a person who has a background in philosophy and science. She's actually a noted bioethicist. She is on the President's Council for Bioethics now. She's one of 13 people advising the President on all of the ethical ramifications of coughed up by the progress of medical science. She had just delivered a talk on the ethical problems, as she saw them, of using neuroimaging technology as lie detection. And she was worried that we might be exposing captured terrorists to lie detection techniques and thereby infringing upon their cognitive liberty. Okay, so on the one hand, she had these very fine-grained and quite scrupulous ethical notions applying to our possible overreach, but was quite sanguine about the prospects of removing the eyeballs of children. And it seemed to me she seemed to be astonishingly detached from the very real suffering of millions of women in Afghanistan. And so this idea, which is actually, this is a especially clear example, but I get this by the hundreds and thousands in emails and blog posts now. Many people in our society think something has happened in the last 200 years of intellectual progress that has made it impossible to speak about moral truth. And so the purpose of my book now and what I will try to persuade you of in this talk is that that's not true, that is in fact a myth. And the myth is really anchored to this notion that there is a radical disjunction between facts and values, that facts are the sort of thing that science can deal with, and this is from physics and chemistry and biology on up. But values are thought to be completely different. They're thought to be, and inconveniently, values capture the most important questions in human life. You know, how should we raise children? What constitutes a good life? What goals should we strive for? And it's thought that answers here are purely the product of culture or personal whim, and that there's just absolutely no framework, there's no intellectual terrain to stand on by which we can say anyone is ever really right or really wrong about values. Now, it's long been obvious that we have needed some universal framework for human values because, for instance, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the UN struggled to put forward a universal declaration of human rights, which was obviously quite a sensible thing to do given what had happened in Europe at that point. And yet the American Anthropological Association came forward saying this is a fool's errand. You can't do this. This is merely one culture foisting its entirely provincial conception of value on the rest of human society. It's intellectually illegitimate. Now notice that this is really the best our social sciences could do with the crematory of Auschwitz still smoking. This was 1947. So what I would argue to you is that we can understand values in terms of facts, that they reduce to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. And there are many old and I think ultimately boring and confusing debates in philosophy that I'm going to sidestep here. But I want to invite you, there will be a Q&A session after I speak, and if anyone feels that I have just missed the boat philosophically, I would very much like to hear from you. But I will give you sort of one philosophical argument by which to make this case. Imagine a universe in which every conscious creature suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. I call this the worst possible misery for everyone. Okay. That's bad. Okay, if you don't think that's bad, I don't know what you could mean by the word bad. If you think there might be something worse than the worst possible misery for everyone, I don't know what you mean, and what's more, I don't think you know what you mean. Okay, so from my point of view, all you have to buy is that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. And that immediately, that creates a continuum where you have the worst possible misery for everyone over here, and then every other possible state of the universe, which is better, by definition. And given that conscious experience is arising out of how the universe is, it is in some way dependent upon the laws of nature, then you see that there must be right and wrong ways to move in this space. There will be wrong ways to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. And there will be right ways to seek different possible states of well-being. And therefore values, that which can be valued, fall into the domain of facts. All the facts that determine the conscious experience of conscious creatures. And I think we have some very serviceable ethical intuitions here about our ethical obligations toward other creatures, other people and other animals, which tacitly track this terrain, because we are more concerned about our fellow primates than we are about insects. And I think we're right to be, simply because we have every reason to believe that primates can suffer a much broader range of experience. They have states of well-being that can be cut off by our mistreatment of them. But again, the thing to notice is that this is a factual claim. I could be wrong about this. It could be that we're wrong about the way in which physical complexity relates to subjective complexity. And if we are wrong, then maybe the inner lives of ants are something that are far richer than we imagine. There's no reason to believe that, but again, I'm just pointing out this is a factual claim about the relationship between mind and matter. And we don't worry about rocks, about our treatment of rocks, because we don't think rocks can suffer. And so we are concerned about changes in the well-being of conscious creatures when we think ethically. And also, even if your beliefs about morality and good and evil are ultimately anchored to religion, even if you think that the real cash value of morality is what happens after death, either an experience of an eternity of happiness with God or an eternity of suffering in hell, you are still worried about consciousness and its potential changes. You're worried about, in this case, you just think the most important changes in consciousness happen after death. So again, I don't think that religion offers a different framework for thinking about it. It just offers a different timeline for thinking about changes in consciousness. Now, many people worry that arguing that well-being is the basis of value and morality is somehow arbitrary, and that unless we could define well-being really rigorously, this is a illegitimate thing to do. Well, by analogy, I'd ask you to consider the concept of health, physical health. This is a concept that changes over the years. It's very difficult to define. When this statue was carved, the life expectancy of a human being was about 25 or 30. Now it's 80 in the developed world. It could be that we'll one day live to have completely different expectations of the normal range of human health. I mean, we may live to see a time where you could expect to be able to regrow a missing limb like a salamander. And if you couldn't do that, you would go straight to the hospital because there's something terribly wrong with you. The fact that health as a concept is open-ended and can change based on our own progress in science does not make the distinction between health and disease any less clear or consequential. And certainly the distinction between life and death is perfectly clear and consequential. And there's a science of human health. It's medicine. And it's not... The elasticity of the concept of health is not a problem for science. And what you never hear in the face of this concept of health is a fundamentally skeptical challenge of the sort that I get in talking about morality. So someone will say, who are you to say that well-being has anything to do with morality? What if someone wanted to torture every person on earth to the point of madness? Who's to say they're not being as moral as you are? That's the kind of skeptical philosophical challenge I get. But you never hear someone say, well, who are you to say that someone dying of terminal smallpox is not as healthy as you are? How could you convince someone with smallpox who thought he was healthy that he wasn't healthy? You never hear the philosophical underpinnings of medicine challenged in this way. Another way to see that this distinction between facts and values makes no sense is to look at just how we make the most basic scientific claims about the nature of the world. So we have this substance called water. About 150 years ago, we realized that it was made of components. It's 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. Now, what do we do when someone comes into the room saying, well, that's not how I choose to think about water? That's chemistry for me is whatever confirms the book of Genesis. A person is free to use the word chemistry any way they want, but no one is under any obligation to take them seriously. They're simply not talking about chemistry. And when you have to convince someone that water is really 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, I mean, the most basic factual claim about the nature of matter, all you can do is appeal to values. You have to appeal to scientific values like the value of understanding the world or the value of evidence. If someone doesn't respect evidence, what evidence are you going to give them to prove that they should respect it? If someone doesn't value logical consistency, what logical argument are you going to give them that will demonstrate that they should? So there are people who, based on alternate value schemes, place themselves outside the conversation of science. And it would be the same with any scientific understanding of human value. But it's no different. If it's not a problem in chemistry, it shouldn't be a problem with morality. And it's so too with any other scientific value. Parsimony, respect for mathematical elegance in certain areas of science. These are value terms. Now, another way to bridge this gap between facts and values is to look at what belief is, how we form beliefs about the world, and just what it is to try to represent the reality in our thoughts. And we form beliefs about facts, and this constitutes science and history and journalism and every other domain in which we claim to be talking about the way the world is. But we also form beliefs about values, and this captures all of the juicy questions in life, meaning and morality and spiritual experience. But it's always seemed to me that these two operations, why many people think they're quite different, are the same. And so we did some neuroimaging work where we put people in a fMRI scanner and we gave them statements to read, very simple statements drawn from many different categories. And some of these categories, it was mathematics and geography and ethics and religion. So very dissimilar content areas. But we found that the difference between belief and disbelief was essentially the same regardless of content. So on the left you have all of our categories bin together, and you get this area of signal in the what's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain. But we were able to separate out mathematics and ethics, which were really our most dissimilar content areas. Mathematics was just equations being judged true or false. And ethics was very value-laden statements like, it's good to be kind to children versus it's good to torture children. So a completely different content, and yet the difference between accepting a proposition as true and rejecting it as false was essentially the same. And so what I would argue to you is that if the brain is doing the same thing when it accepts a proposition versus when it rejects it, regardless of whether it's about Jesus being born of a virgin or about mathematics, we should be hesitant to ascribe radically different categories to those operations in our conversation with one another. So, from my point of view, belief is really our best effort to map reality in our thoughts. And when we seem to succeed in doing this, when our claims about the way the world is seem to survive every test that the world can throw at them, we call it knowledge. So there's no radical difference between belief and knowledge. There's just knowledge is a category of beliefs that we take seriously and we have high confidence in. And there's clearly a continuum of facts about which we can be more or less aware or more or less confused that relate to how human communities flourish. And we know that it's possible to live in a failed state where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, where mothers can't feed their children, where strangers can find no basis to cooperate with one another peacefully. I mean, you look at a place like Congo now, where people's daily concern is avoiding getting murdered by drug-addled soldiers, and women are being raped by the tens of thousands continuously. We know that there is something to be known about how human beings individually and human communities can move out of those conditions towards something quite a bit more idyllic, something much more like the lives we tend to live, where we can value creativity, where we can have intellectual interest, where we can read books, where we can even conceive of going to a book festival. I mean, all of this is taking place on the basis of some very real gains in civil society. And there's something to be understood about that. And those processes clearly can be understood on many levels. They can be understood at the level of biology, at the level of the kinds of genes that predispose people to trust one another. We can understand psychopathy at the level of the brain, and positive social emotions like compassion and empathy. And we can also understand this at a collective scale. We can understand the influence of economics and political arrangements on human beings individually and their collective behavior. But all of these facts fall potentially within the purview of science. I mean, we're talking about genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology and economics. So again, I'm arguing that the truths that spell the difference between abject human misery and the kind of flourishing that's possible for us in this world, these truths fall within our factual discussion about the way the world is, which is to say an ongoing scientific understanding of the human mind. I think this is easier to see if you just imagine two people living on Earth. Just imagine Adam and Eve, no one else. Okay. Clearly there are right and wrong answers to the question of how they might maximize their well-being. I mean, wrong answer number one, they could smash each other in the face with a large rock. Okay, clearly that is not the best answer to the problem of how two human beings can thrive given an opportunity to live in this world. Now, how does the situation change when you add 6.7 billion more people to the experiment? I'm arguing that it doesn't. It clearly gets more complicated, but the difference between right and wrong answers, I think, is entirely preserved there. So what I'm asking you to visualize is a kind of landscape. I call it a moral landscape, where the peaks correspond to the heights of human well-being, and the valleys correspond to the lowest depths of misery. And the first thing that sort of drops out of this model is that it's very likely that there are many peaks. There may be many different ways for individuals and for communities to thrive that are not equivalent and not compatible. And there could just be many very dissimilar ways to organize human societies so as to produce the kind of well-being that's possible for us. But clearly there are many more ways to not be on a peak. There are many worse answers than any of those. Now, the fact that there are many right answers to the question of how to produce human flourishing, or there may be many right answers, isn't a problem. And by analogy, I would ask you to consider food. I would never argue to you that there must be one right food to eat. I mean, clearly there are many right answers to the question, what is food? Okay, but the difference between food and poison is still absolutely clear. And it's clear even though that there are exceptions, like some people are allergic to peanuts and will die if they eat them. I mean, we can understand all of those caveats in the context of chemistry and biology and every science related to human nutrition. And so too with principles that seem to admit of exceptions. Many people worry that if you have an ethical principle that admits of an exception, well, then there's no such thing as moral truth. So for instance, if it's wrong to lie, then it always has to be wrong to lie. And if you can find a situation in which it's right to lie, then there's no such thing as moral truth. But notice we don't do this take a game like chess. You know, if you want to play good chess, don't lose your queen is a very good principle to follow. But it clearly admits of exceptions. There are moments where it's absolutely essential to sacrifice your queen, where it's a brilliant thing to do. And yet chess is the prototypical situation of objective right and wrong answers. And not losing your queen is one of the best principles you can follow. And this notion of a moral landscape allows for the prospects of what we call spiritual or mystical experience. I think there's no question that there are contemplative insights that people can have that can be very hard won, that can maybe require a lot of training and talent to have. I think it's quite possible that there is such a thing as moral genius. You know, people who have insight into the kinds of priorities they should have and the ways they should live so as to really experience kinds of well-being that very few of us are aware are even possible. I used to be in the habit of saying that undoubtedly there's a Tiger Woods of compassion out there somewhere. Now, for obvious reasons, that analogy doesn't quite run through. But in any case, I think positive mental states like compassion are now viewed as skills in neuroscience. They're trainable to some degree. People have different talents with regard to being aware of the emotions of others and being able to be motivated altruistically. And there undoubtedly are right and wrong ways to raise children to be as compassionate as they can be. And so again, all of this falls within the purview of a growing scientific understanding of the human mind. How many of you who can see this photo recognize it? This is a photo of apparently happy Nazis, but there was a photo album recently discovered. It's now called the Auschwitz album, and these photos were entirely unmarked. People didn't know who these Nazis were, and a little research revealed that this was the staff of Auschwitz in its heyday as a killing factory, and this is how they were kind of amusing themselves on their weekends off at a chalet that was sort of close to the death camp. So essentially, these people are enjoying accordion music, and other photos where they're eating blueberries and sunbathing under the plume of human ash coming out of the crematory of Auschwitz. Now, my notion of a moral landscape admits of the possibility of kind of pathological islands of relative happiness like this, where I don't doubt that these people are really smiling. I mean, these aren't fake smiles. They're certainly not all psychopaths. I think these are probably normal people who love their kids and love their pets and went home and listened to Wagner and shed a tear. And yet they have a belief system that has walled off their moral concern from the rest of humanity. And so clearly this is not a peak on the moral landscape. And it seems to me the challenge that we all face, the challenge that we face as a global society, is to extend the circle of our moral concern to the rest of humanity. And there are obviously ideologies that make that difficult or impossible. Now I want to spend a little time talking about Islam because I think it's, and I want to talk about why religion is not the proper source of our moral norms at this point. And the reason why it shouldn't be becomes excruciatingly clear when you focus on Islam. And so I want to do that for a minute. I want to be very clear about the spirit in which I do this, however, because I'm not talking about all Muslims, clearly, and I'm not talking about races of people or ethnicities or nationalities. I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm talking about the logical and behavioral consequences of certain ideas. I'm talking about doctrines, the doctrine of Islam. And one thing to notice is that we have this one word, religion, which is a suitcase term that is not very useful. Religion is a word like sports. There are sports that are entirely safe, that entail no physical risk at all. And there are sports that are synonymous with violence. So there's a sport like badminton, and there's a sport like Thai boxing. And they have basically nothing in common apart from breathing. Okay. And religion is a lot like that. I mean, there is a religion of peace in this world. It's called Jainism. It's a religion of India, has something like 10 million adherents at this point. The Jains, their core principle is nonviolence. The more extreme you get as a Jain, the less we have to worry about you. Right? So the problem is not. I mean, we hear that the problem is religious extremism. No, the problem is not religious extremism. The problem is the actual ideas in specific religions, because extremist Jains are basically paralyzed by their pacifism. I mean, they're vegetarian, needless to say, but they drink every sip of water through cheesecloth to filter out any bug they might swallow. And when they walk, they don't take their eyes off the ground unless they tread on an insect. Now, Islam is not remotely a religion of peace, and that's a problem. It's a problem that we are taking refuge in the euphemisms about it. So for a minute, I just want to talk honestly about the doctrine of Islam. And you may recognize these men. I have Mullah Omar, Osama bin Laden, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed up there. Now, whatever they may disagree about politically or personally, they really agree about the nature of reality and how to live within it. I would think these three men agree about those core questions more than any three people in this tent. I mean, they are on the same page because they are literally drawing their worldview from a book. And this is a book that they imagine was dictated to the Prophet Muhammad in a cave by the Archangel Gabriel. I apologize for the cartoonish nature of this illustration, but illustrations of Muhammad are somewhat difficult to come by at the moment for reasons we are familiar with. But the net result of this is that we have a book, the Quran, which is believed to be the perfect word of the creator of the universe. And it is a profoundly mediocre book. It is not the best book humanity has ever produced on any subject. And that is a fact that awaits the attention of anyone who wants to take a weekend to read the book. And there are many problems that visit us on the basis of this book. One is that it's a relatively short book. It's not like the Bible. It's not, you can't cherry pick it with the same ease that Christians and Jews can cherry pick the Bible. I mean, Christians can cherry pick the New Testament and get Jesus in half his moods and come away with a truly benign belief system. It doesn't mean it's factually true, but they come away with a savior who was essentially a hippie who got crucified, who gave the Sermon on the Mount and other kind of wonderfully benign and pacific messages. There's no Sermon on the Mount in the Quran. And the basic message of the Quran is that the infidel is fit only for the fires of hell, and there's nothing better that can happen to a person in this life than to die in defense of the one true faith. And Muhammad, his example is quite different. Muhammad didn't get crucified. Muhammad was the Alexander the Great of the Muslim world. I mean, he was a conquering general. And these are differences that matter, and the great challenge of our time, I think, is to figure out how to inspire a renaissance in the Muslim world. And again, this challenge is a great one because we're talking about intellectual isolation. The Arab world especially is isolated in a way that very few people can appreciate intellectually. The country of Spain translates more of the world's literature and learning into Spanish every year than the entire Arab world has translated into Arabic since the 9th century. Now, the Arab world is only 25% of the Muslim world, but it controls a majority of the mosques, and the Arab world is the engine of the worldview that is Islam. And the proper attitude with which one should live one's life on the basis of this doctrine is in perpetual supplication to this invisible deity who gave us this perfect book. And this is a photo of Muslims in Kashmir worshiping at a shrine that's believed to contain a single beard hair from the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I do not mean to make light of how difficult it might be for Muslims in Kashmir at this moment. Undoubtedly, it's difficult. And I actually don't mean to denigrate the kinds of positive experiences you can have practicing in this way. And I think devotion is a positive mental state, and obviously having a strong community is positive. But it seems to me that given all the challenges that these people face in this world, and the prospects of real collaboration that a society can discover, these people have something more important to do with their time than worship the beard hair of a person who may very well have been a schizophrenic. And another message that comes out of this doctrine, which is truly unavoidable, though you can dance around the facts, is that the status of women is secondary. And the ultimate expression of that, I think, at this moment is life for women fully veiled under a burqa. I think it's a great failure of liberalism at this moment, and I consider myself a liberal on basically all questions. But it is a great failure of liberalism that we hear kind of sanctimonious appeals to religious sensitivity, that it's somehow wrong to criticize this practice when there's no sensitivity for what life is actually like for women forced to live this way. I mean, our sensitivity is misplaced if we're worried about offending the men who want their wives to live this way. We should be concerned about the women. And yet, even feminists in our society take issue with any strong condemnation of this practice. Another result of this worldview is it has become an engine of a kind of death cult in our time, but especially noticeable in our time given technology and given our collision with the Muslim world. But this death cult has existed since the time of the Prophet. But the endless suicide bombings that we see are an expression of a theological expectation. I mean, this is what certainty of paradise gets you. And so this photo is the aftermath of a bombing of Shia Muslims in Pakistan by Sunnis. The Sunnis consider Shiites to be apostates and regularly bomb their mosques and funeral processions and pilgrimages. Notice this has nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy. This is Muslim on Muslim violence. The only difference between these people is religious confession. This has nothing to do with Israel and the plight of the Palestinians. This is Sunni waking up in the morning deciding that it is worth dying for the privilege of blowing up Shia apostates. And I want to linger over these details here because I fear that it's very difficult for secular people to connect with just how deeply these beliefs are held. I mean, so this is they bombed a procession of Shia, but then they sent another suicide bomber to bomb the hospital when the ambulances came in with the casualties. So this photograph is actually outside the hospital where the doctors and nurses and casualties were bombed by another suicide bomber. I mean, just imagine that the kind of the scale of this misspent human energy. I mean, this entails creativity. If this was a kind of a smart idea on the suicide bomber's part, but someone had to volunteer for this. And you just look at the aftermath of this. I mean, you look at this girl over the body of her mother. It seems to me that it is absolutely obvious that this is smallpox for the mind. There is nothing good about this. And it is not, the crucial point I want to make is it is not unscientific to say this. The fear that there's something unscientific about saying this is tantamount to our saying that we know absolutely nothing about human well-being. It's identical to saying, well, we have 150 years of brain science and psychology and sociology behind us, and we've made some real gains in the treatment of women in our society, but maybe blowing up Shia processions and then blowing up mothers and blowing up the doctors, maybe that's as good as anything we've come up with. Three minutes. Okay, well, I have too many slides. I just, for a moment, lest you get the sense that I'm narrowly focused on the problem of Islam, I want to say that the disconnection between religion and the real details of human and animal well-being is obvious in many other faiths. So, for instance, the Catholic Church simply is more concerned about stopping contraception at this moment than stopping the rape of children. I mean, that is a fact based on the level of its doctrine and the level of its actions in the world. It's more concerned about gay marriage than genocide. This is a diabolical inversion of priorities. And what I would suggest to you is that the moment you link questions of morality to questions of human and animal well-being, you see that the use of the terminology, you're talking about the morality, the moral problem of contraception, is a false use. I mean, the church could talk about the physics of the transubstantiation. It could talk about the physics that allows the Holy Ghost to be here, there, and everywhere. Okay, but no physicist would have to take that discourse seriously. That's a misuse of the word physics. And we define our terms in physics very much to the detriment of anyone who would want to talk about the physics of the Eucharist. So we can do this on the subject of morality as well. And so finally, I would say to you is that the only prospect of building a global civilization where we converge on the same kinds of answers to the most important questions in human life, the same kinds of environmental and economic and political goals, is for us to come up with a framework in which we can talk about values and right and wrong and good and evil in universal terms. And I think an honest discussion about the prospects of human and animal well-being is that framework. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions, and there's a microphone right here, so if you have a question, if you'd come up to the microphone.
Sam, tell us what your opinion is of France implementing the burqa ban.
The question is asking about the wisdom of France banning the burqa legally. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. My bias is that passing laws of that sort is the wrong move, because I think people should be free to wear whatever they want. The reason why I'm not entirely sure in this case is that clearly there are women and girls being forced to veil themselves, and there's it's hard to see how you provide a context in which they can be free to make the kinds of choices they want without passing a law. But by analogy, there's a law passed in Austria and I believe Germany as well that makes it illegal to deny the Holocaust. Okay, I think that's an idiotic law. I mean, that's not the lever you want to move in public opinion. Is not a law banning bad ideas. And we don't need laws banning bad ideas. We just need to criticize bad ideas. But the burqa ban may be a little more difficult than that.
I was wondering how you differentiate your idea of the moral landscape from utilitarianism,
Yeah.
the idea of getting the most good for the most people,
Right.
and then how you might defend the moral landscape against those many criticisms of utilitarianism.
Well, good question. Well, I don't tend. I think that the traditional presentation of utilitarianism has been understandably prey to certain criticisms. So when you present a kind of narrow focus on pleasure or happiness, people are led to believe, well, okay, so if it's all just about pleasure, why not take heroin all day? I mean, that's really pleasurable. But clearly, that doesn't meet the test for anyone's best possible life. And I think a fully searching notion of utility is actually not vulnerable to those kinds of criticisms. But I think the categories of utilitarianism versus deontology and virtue ethics, and a lot of the debates that have happened in philosophy there have broken down on false distinctions and arguments that just don't have to be continually rehearsed. And so I am a consequentialist in some sense, but I don't think my argument is vulnerable to the traditional claims against utilitarianism. As I go into it to some degree in the book, but I try to sort of sidestep a lot of it because a lot of it is frankly, I think, unnecessary. And you also get, for instance, if it's all just about maximizing well-being, well then, what if your doctor was aware that he could, he's got some genius in the back room who's going to do great work, but that he needs new kidneys and a liver and lungs, and so your doctor just decides to go into the waiting room and vivisect everyone who's waiting there for an appointment, so as to save the genius in the back room, because your organs could be better used in him apparently. A narrow focus on the well-being of society seems to suggest that might be an ethical thing to do. But clearly, who would want to live in a society where at any moment your organs could be stolen because some very bright person needs them? I mean, no one would. I mean, there are very obvious reasons not to do that. And so, when you actually when you have a sufficiently broad conception of well-being and the kinds of principles that maximize it, I think many of the things that critics of utilitarianism fear are not captured by it, like notions of justice and fairness and having a clear conscience and all of that. The cash value of all of that is in well-being at the end of the day. And so, I don't know if that deals with it completely, but.
Hi. What you said today that stood out the most for me was something about even for people who have strong faith in an afterlife. I forgot what it was, but there's still objective facts about well-being to be found there.
Right. If it exists, yeah.
Right, yeah. Right. And I see the utility of that in making a case that it's so whatever effect so justified, that even it would even apply to an imaginary place. When in your last book, one of the most popular quotes from it was that one about certainty in the next life,
right,
and the lack of, or seemingly poor ability of people who have such strong faith in the afterlife of being able to be tolerant. So, yeah. Is it worth making that case? That even for those with this faith in the afterlife.
Well, I think that certainty is dangerous, and there are no good reasons to be certain of the afterlife. I mean, anyone who's pretending to be certain about the afterlife is lying to himself or herself. I mean, and it's just not. And given that we have incompatible certainties, I mean, given that the religions actually teach different things in a very zero-sum, non-negotiable way, these certainties have shattered our world into these separate moral communities. I mean, there are hundreds of examples of this, but a very clear one is that if you're really going to be a Christian, you have to believe that Jesus was divine. And if you're really going to be a Muslim, you have to believe he wasn't. I mean, you can still honor Jesus, but it says in 2 places in the Quran that if you think Jesus was divine, you're going to spend eternity in hell. So this is a deal breaker. I mean, this is a coin toss. And
for a huge portion of the population, the actual sacred scriptures, but I think there's probably an even broader or larger portion of the population for whom the real deal breaker is this sense, this universal sense of hope and something waiting for us,
right?
After a life of struggling and suffering,
right?
And
well, I think that's it's easy to see how that helps people in certain situations, in that it relieves. It obviously relieves. If you can believe that, there are certain occasions where it clearly relieves your suffering. There's no question. I mean, atheists want to deny that sometimes. It's undeniable. I mean, if your child dies, and you really believe that she's been taken up to be with Jesus, and it's in a few short years you're going to be reunited, that solves the problem. And I don't think there.
From Into Faith was so wonderful, and quoted so often.
But I think there's that comes at a tremendous cost. That kind of the anodyne effect of faith, and when you look, and the costs are, I mean, the costs are so large at a geopolitical level. The collision between incompatible faiths. And there are just obvious opportunities that are forsaken in light of that belief. We are. The thing we can be sure of, absolutely sure of, is that we are in a circumstance now that can get a whole lot better or a whole lot worse. And what we need is truly intelligent, open-ended, non-dogmatic, non-sectarian conversations about how to do that. And religion, 9 times out of 10, is a glaring obstacle, even when it is providing comfort to people in certain situations. So.
And I'm glad that you didn't, what you said today about that, I'm glad it wasn't in the book.
Well, thank you for your question.
Hi. I just wanted to, as far as one of your four horsemen said that morality was innate, would you say basically that your perspective is education through science, etc., then allows you to have a certain morality? And if that's the case, are you very pessimistic as far as you would say, I mean, I'm assuming you're saying education, colleges, etc., and yet, I mean, it just doesn't, through your knowledge of philosophy, thousands of years,
right.
Why do you, I mean, what do you bring to the table now? I'm sorry, I haven't read your latest book. What are you doing to convince other people, or what is, you know, why now, or what do you have as far as that? And would you say you're more or less apologetic for religion now? I thought end of faith, etc., you're kind of more apologetic.
Right. No, nothing's changed in terms of apologizing for religion. Well, this claim that morality is innate can be a little confusing. Clearly, we have moral emotions and types of moral reasoning that are emerging out of our biology and at some level are modified by culture. It's like, by analogy, you can think of language. I mean, we all come into this world ready to speak a language, but then you learn the language based on what culture you happen to arrive in. So we all come ready to speak Chinese, but we don't because we're not raised in China. And we come into this world ready to recognize morally salient situations. We feel disgust in response to certain things. We have a notion of non-harming. We put something very much like the golden rule is something that is probably by default where we wind up in ethical terms. But all of this can get modified by culture, and there are people who don't have the full toolkit. There are psychopaths who just don't feel empathy for other people, and that's something that we can understand neurologically. Now, science, up until this moment, has limited itself to understanding all of that descriptively. You can tell an evolutionary story about why we're social primates, and we've come to be the way we are based on millions of years of negotiating rather harrowing social encounters with each other. And we can understand how this type of reasoning arises in the brain. What does the brain have to do to notice morally salient situations? But science has been purely descriptive. What I'm saying is that there's another chapter open to us in science, which is the moment we recognize that we can talk about morality but evolution has not designed us to flourish to the ultimate degree. Evolution doesn't care about our well-being, really. It can't see it doesn't care about most of what we care about. It doesn't care about novels. It doesn't care about music. It doesn't care about mathematics or science, or it cares about successful reproduction of the species. And so basically everything. So we have sort of flown the perch that has been prepared for us by evolution, and we have to do that with the brains that we've evolved with. But the prospects of human flourishing can be understood scientifically, and we can talk about morality and human values in the context of that larger conversation, and that's no longer just a descriptive conversation about what people happen to do. That's a conversation about what we can and should do so as to maximize well-being, and that's many scientists fear that somehow you forsake your scientific dispassion the moment you start talking about the way people should live. But we don't do that. I mean, that's not true of health. I mean, people shouldn't get smallpox, and we don't do it on chemistry. People should rely on evidence, and they should rely on coherent argument. And when you see that morality really translates into psychological and social health in the end, then the stigma around making recommendations, I think, should fall away.
First and foremost, I'm not only standing to refute your past proposition about Jesus, the Islam perception about Jesus being undivine. Jesus is one of the highest revered prophet in Islam.
That's true.
Wait for me.
But he's not divine.
He was born miraculously, which is no strange. Adam was even with no father and no mother. Jesus is well revered, and his mother Mary is one of the highest respected lady in Islam.
He is respected in Islam. That's undeniable.
So, for you to say if Islam recognized Jesus as prophet, what the Talmud or the Jewish faith says.
But he's not divine. I'm very careful with my words here because he is not divine.
We have limited time, as the lady said.
That would be polytheism.
The lady said we have very limited time here. What the Talmud or the Jewish faith say about Jesus, they disprove him. They don't even recognize him as Jesus. As prophet. Nothing is being said about that. Before the invasion of Iraq, you have Muslim, Shia, and Sunni living side by side, intermarried. Saddam Hussein, vice president, Yassin Ramadan was a Shia person. All right, 2006, British special forces were caught wearing turban with explosive. When they were apprehended and imprisoned, they brought war tank and bombarded the place and released them. So if you told me,
I get the point.
If you told me the foreign people are not part of what's happening there, then most people here are intellectual. They know what's going on. So,
would you like a response? I get the gist of your question.
Thank you. But the brainwash and the media bias will not continue to fool Americans.
Permit me to respond to your
intelligent people here today. They will find the truth.
Do you actually want to? Do you want a response? Okay. Well, first of all, you're wrong about the status of Jesus in Islam. He is certainly respected. He's considered a prophet, but he's not divine, and that's a crucial distinction. And if you really want to push that conversation further, what's the status of Hinduism? I mean, if I were going to grant you that there's no conflict between Islam and Christianity, which is there's no reason to grant, there is clearly a conflict between Islam and Hinduism. I mean, polytheism is perfectly anathematized under Islam, there's no debate there, and there are a billion Hindus who are absolutely wrong and fit only for conversion or the sword. And yes, it is true that our invasion of Iraq pulled the lid of a dictatorship off of these ethnic and religious tensions. But to say that life among Sunni and Shia has for 1,000 years been wonderful is to disregard all of Muslim history. It's just not true. And on a daily, and I wasn't, for the most part, I'm not even talking about Iraq, I was talking about Pakistan. And on a daily basis, Shia mosques and Sufi mosques and Ahmadi mosques in Pakistan are blown up by Sunnis. And it's not the result of Western occupation, because we're not in Pakistan. It's been going on for quite some time, and it's understandable. The problem we have is that someone like Osama bin Laden, while you can say he's distorting the faith of Islam, it's not really obvious how he is distorting it. And you really have to split hairs to see how he's distorting it. Now, if he were Amish, or he were a Jain, or he were a Buddhist, it would be absolutely obvious how he was distorting his faith. His behavior would be unintelligible. It is all too intelligible by the light of Islam, and to deny that is to simply lie about the contents of the Quran and the Hadith.
I'm so sorry that we don't have any more time for questions, but he will be back in back to time. Thank you very much.
This concludes our live coverage from the 2010 Texas Book Festival. To watch this or other Book TV events, go to booktv.org. Today's coverage of the 2010 Texas Book Festival will re-air in its entirety tonight at 1 a.m. Eastern.